Hello and welcome to Japan Expert Insights and our discussion series on geopolitics in the Indo-Pacific and Japan's role in the region. Every second Monday, Dr. Stephen Nagy, Senior Associate Professor at the Department of Politics and International Studies at the International Christian University in Tokyo, and host Maya Matsuoka, host a discussion on the latest developments, new challenges, and shifts in the geopolitics of the Indo-Pacific region. In this podcast, we welcome comments, questions, and opinions, so if you haven't done so yet, join us next time. In the meantime, you can find us at japanexpertinsights.com and our YouTube channel, where we upload audio episodes on Japanese politics, business insights, and the Japan's role in the Indo-Pacific region. Good evening to everyone who is here. Thank you very much for joining us. I can see Lynn and Hiroaki, Gabor, also Lee, and also some other people. Today we have again Professor Stephen Nagy, Senior Associate Professor at the ICU in Tokyo, and we're going to talk about the latest events in geopolitics, the geopolitics of the Indo-Pacific. Of course, I believe that, we can talk about other events out of the region as well, especially if they have, if they influence the region here as well. So I don't want to actually keep anybody waiting any much longer. So Stephen, let's start. And of course, we can invite people to join the conversation once you have done with this, with the briefing, and that's it.
Okay, thank you very much, Maya. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining today. My apologies for not making it last week. I guess what's really interesting to start with today in terms of the discussions about the Indo-Pacific is the State of the Union address by President Biden last week. And I think why that's an interesting place to start, because what we're growingly see is that the United States is charting out an Indo-Pacific strategy under the Biden administration that really focuses on competition. And why I think this is important is that it suggests that from the U.S.'s point of view, that as it sees China and it sees the Indo-Pacific region, that it feels that it must outcompete, and there's another way to say this, but I'll come back to this, outcompete China at every level to ensure that the region remains a rules-based region. Now, why this is important and what are some of the examples of that? I think we've seen, the importance, of course, is to ensure that rules are the basis for how we negotiate and manage foreign affairs or international relations within the region, whether that's the management of sea lines of communication, or as Hiroaki's interest is intermediate missile treaties, or thinking about how Southeast Asian countries are negotiating relationships with big countries like China. So competition was a really, really important aspect of, I think, the speech. And I'm going to come back to the second thing that I want to bring up to this week, and that's the release of the Asia Power Index. If you've seen it, it's a great resource. We're going to host the Lowy Institute in March with the Yokosuka Council for Asia-Pacific Studies, but they came up with some really interesting views about the Quad, about AUKUS, about China, and about the United States. And why I think this is important for the geopolitics of the Indo-Pacific is that despite prominent leaders in Southeast Asia saying that they don't want to choose between China and the United States, they definitely want to anchor the United States within the region. There's still deep mistrust with regards to China within the region, and they see things like the Quad and the AUKUS framework as positive ways to balance an increasingly assertive China within the region. So I think that this is the results from the Southeast Asian survey out of the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies. And I wanted to mention the Lowy Institute's index. And this is another important point that I want to touch upon. And it looked at rankings over the pandemic to today. And what we see is the United States has relatively moved up in terms of most elements of its power, except economics. And this is where China remains in the lead terms of its rankings into the Asia Power Index. But what we've seen is middle powers like Japan, like India, as well as others, actually fall in the ranking. And why this is important, it suggests that there's a bigger and bigger gap between the great powers, that's the United States and China, and the middle powers in shaping the region's dynamics. And this is really important because I think for smaller countries like Canada, like Vietnam, like Japan, that are trying to maintain their strategic autonomy within the region, that they should understand that the comprehensive nature of power within the region the gap is only growing between the leaders, that's the United States and China, and everyone else. And this is going to affect the dynamics behind what happens in the Indo-Pacific. So I guess that these are just a few things on the table that I wanted to throw out there. One is Biden's speech. What does it mean for how we define competition, the Indo-Pacific? And again, the United States is thinking about competition in the areas of technology. They're thinking about in the areas of trade. They're thinking about in the areas of security, and they are interested in elevating their competitiveness so that they can engage in the region and maintain a very, very strong footprint within the region. There's many reasons why they're taking a competitive approach, and I think if you're interested in this, you can take a look at Twilight Struggle by Hal Brands, which is a really great book outlining how the United States dealt with the Soviet Union, and over a decades-long period of time, they really outcompeted the Soviet Union at many, many, many different levels, which created internal contradictions within the system to exacerbate eventually creating the conditions for the Cold War to end on a very American terms. The second point I want to mention again is the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies survey on Southeast Asia and how Southeast Asian countries increasingly see the Quad and the AUKUS as favorable institutions to anchor the United States within the region. And this is good for more American diplomacy within the Indo-Pacific region. But it's not only anchoring the United States within the region, it's anchoring the United States along with strong partners like Japan, Australia, and India. And it's this collective power that really is important. And I think Southeast Asian countries are recognizing this. And then lastly was the results of the Asian Power Index by the Lowy Institute, again, demonstrating that the United States has it comprehensively increased its position in the ranking, except in terms of economic networks. And this goes back and it links to my second point today, that Southeast Asian countries and other countries want more of the United States, not only in terms of security as a security provider, but importantly, they want much more of the United States in terms of their economic and trade investments within the region, because this region is a trading region. It's home to at least two trading agreements. That's the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, but we also have the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework and a potential trilateral FTA between South Korea, China, and Japan. They want to trade. They want to trade with their friends. They want to trade with countries that they have challenges with. And survey after survey shows that they want the United States to be part of the trading the trading environment within the region. So I'll stop there and let's hear from some of the people on the call in terms of what they're thinking about the Indo-Pacific or on those key points that I mentioned.
Thank you, Stephen. Yes, we have Lynn. I'm inviting other people as well. So hopefully more people will join. Yes. So everybody who wants to join, please come up on stage. Let us know. Okay, and so just one question, Stephen, I have to you. So you mentioned that, the United States actually competed with the Soviet Unions during the Cold War, and the country actually managed to end the Cold War on very American terms. But now, at this moment of time, even though the United States is focusing on competitiveness and competition, so we are not in the state of a Cold War. Do you see, a new Cold War coming up, something similar to the Cold War that was actually, I wouldn't say developed, but that existed between the Soviet Unions and the Western world?
Well, I think that there's deep concerns that that's the direction of U.S.-China competition, and that neither side is finding ways to communicate, and both sides are finding ways to wall off their economies, wall off their social media, wall off their education systems from each other. In this sense, we are not at the peak, or we're not at the same level. I guess we wouldn't describe the relationship in the same way as we described the relationship between the Soviet Union and the United States, because last year there was $760 billion of trade between both countries. During the Cold War, there was no trade, or almost no trade, between the two countries, making it easier or more feasible to fundamentally cut off relations and compete. So I think that there are parallels we can draw from the study of the Soviet Union and the United States and their Cold War competition, in terms of the United States using investment in infrastructure, investment in connectivity, investment in military research, investment in expanding their security broadly, and that this was used to outcompete the Soviet system, and the Soviet system eventually, turned inward and broke down from within. And this is ultimately how I think the United States dealt with the challenge of the Soviet Union. Can we draw parallels? Yes. Is China the same kind of security provider or security challenge? Absolutely not. Its economy is much bigger. It's intertwined to the United States. They benefit from each other and each other's engagement. We've had 40 years of deep engagement in terms of university exchanges, student exchanges, economic exchanges. And as a result, it's hard to say we're in a Cold War. But influential research groups like the Eurasia Group talk about a tech war, in that the United States and China are competing for dominating the key technologies that they feel will be critical to shaping the Indo-Pacific and the world broadly over the next 20, 30, 40 years. And that's artificial intelligence, the digital economy, quantum computing, even dominating the cyberspace. And it seems that this is the area where the competition is the most severe. And it is the area that I think both parties are extremely interested in pursuing, in terms of dominating those areas. They want to be the rule setters, not the rule takers. And I think this is why they've invested so much of their resources into those areas.
Right. Thank you for that. So my next question, though, is about the competition, not here in this region, not in the Indo-Pacific, but in other regions of the world. So we know that China has a strong presence in Africa. How do you see that competition there? Or is the United States actually thinking about establishing a stronger presence in Africa to compete with China there as well?
So this is good. This is a great question. And I think that we sometimes look at the Indo-Pacific and the geopolitics of the Indo-Pacific only through the lens of the United States and China. And I think this is a mistake. Northern Africa and parts of Eastern and Western Africa really have traditionally been the backyard or the areas of influence of the Europeans. And what we see is the Europeans trying to invest more of their resources in Africa in terms of infrastructure connectivity and development policies. And I think this is quite interesting. Japan is trying to step up its game in Eastern Africa. Whether it can do that or not, I think that's an open question. Not because they don't have the physical capability. I think that it's more about the balance of capacities. How much should they spread their diplomatic and financial resources throughout the region? And that is a bit of a concern. If they invest too much time and too much money in too broad of area, they're not going to really garner any of the kinds of political gains and security gains and economic gains they're interested in. The United States has a presence, but its presence is relatively small. But that being said, if you look at data sets like the Afrobarometer, what they continue to show is that African countries themselves, they look positively at China's Belt Road Initiative investments in the region, but at the same time, they want more of they want a balanced investment, and they still look at the U.S. model as the model that they would like to move forward on. So I think that's quite interesting, and it's a little bit more nuanced than saying, the United States should be part of Africa or not, it's ultimately up to the Africans. And I do think that the Chinese do have a head start in the post World War II period. They have actively sought out and courted African countries to ensure that they are aligned with Chinese interests, but at the same time, they have not been completely successful in their reach out to African countries because African countries have their own interests.
Right. Okay. So thank you for that. I would like to hear Lynn and Gabor and Mark as well. So Lynn, hello. You were the first to come up here. So I'm going to ask you, to share your thoughts with us first.
Yes, so thank you very much, Maya, and thank you, Professor Stephen, for your sharing. I have two questions, but I will start with my first question, specifically about ASEAN and Quad's approach to the Indo-Pacific. Because when I am working on a comparison of these two institutions and their member states, and I found it was quite broad for me, because ASEAN and Quad are the two institutions, and why ASEAN has delivered its own Indo-Pacific Outlook (AOIP) that represent the whole group view and emphasize on the ASEAN centrality. There is also a lot of discussion about the different views of individual ASEAN members. However, from the Quad perspective, as an institution, to my understanding, besides reiterating its commitments to engage in the region through its joint leader statement, individually, each Quad member also has its own Indo-Pacific strategies and visions. So when I try to compare the Indo-Pacific approach between Quad and ASEAN, what I am considering is, should I look at it from the whole group conception in general first, and then exploring the views of individual countries? But in that sense, I find that it would be too broad for me, because for the Quad perspective, I think it would be no problem because there are only 4 countries and all are major actors in the region. But for ASEAN, which comprises more countries and with more diverse view, I am wondering that if there is a proper way to unpack Southeast Asian countries, because I remember you wrote a chapter in a book about Japan's new security partnerships, and you divide Southeast Asian countries into 2 groups of discussion based on their level of economic dependencies on China and threat perception of China. And you did not include the discussion of all other Southeast Asian countries in your chapter. But here, the Indo-Pacific region is much broader and more inclusive concept. So if I want to learn about the convergence and divergence of ASEAN and Quad's approach to Indo-Pacific, how should I group Southeast Asian countries? Or what should I specifically look at when comparing the 2 group approach as well as their individual member states? Thank you.
All right, thank you, Lynn. It's really nice to hear from you. I'll see you later in the week. So I think when we're looking at the Quad, I think the Quad itself continues to evolve. 4 or 5 years ago, it was primarily a security-focused initiative. Today, when we look at the Quad's activities, it seems to have a more blended or a hybrid purpose in terms of public good provision, but also a growing security dimension in terms of the maritime environment. So we see this as one aspect of the Quad. What are the public good provision activities that's engaged in? Well, it's talked about technology, it's talked about infrastructure and connectivity, it's talked a little bit about vaccine provision. I assume that there's going to continue to grow in terms of the areas that it would like to engage in terms of public good provision. And this will be related to what China does, what China doesn't, where they feel that they have the most opportunity to provide some kind of public good. So the Quad also acknowledges ASEAN centrality, which is important for getting buy-in from Southeast Asian countries within the ASEAN Association framework. So I think that this is pretty... this trajectory is quite fixed right now, and that it will continue along those lines. ASEAN, on the other hand, really we see more divergence in ASEAN and its member countries, whether it's Laos and Cambodia or Myanmar, they are increasingly in a position where they have different views than, let's say, Vietnam or Indonesia, the Philippines, and Singapore. So I think that ASEAN, to have a collective or a common approach to the Quad, will be either the lowest common denominator, or it will be increasingly difficult for them to find a common position on many aspects that are significant or add real value to the region. And this is a bit of a worry as we look to where there is interface opportunities between the Quad and the ASEAN countries. ASEAN needs to stand for something, and at this particular stage, it is more in a lot of ways, it's more obstructionist rather than constructivist in terms of finding a proactive and constructive role within the region that adds value and stands for something. And this will probably create tensions between the Quad and ASEAN moving forward. But my assumption is that the Quad members are going to continue to try and find ways to add value to the region that will reflect some, but not all, some of the interests of ASEAN countries.
Yes, so thank you, Professor. I have another question about the role of Quad member in bridging ASEAN and Quad cooperation, because as I shared with you before, that I want to examine the role of Japan, because I think that no other countries in the Quad understand Southeast Asian countries better than Japan, and Japan has also remained the most trusted country in the region for so many consecutive years. However, you also suggested me looking at Australia because it also has a long partnership with Southeast Asia for decades. But if I know correctly, that Australia has never been ranked as trusted partner in the annual Southeast Asian survey. To be honest, I do not read much about Australia. So when you suggested me looking at Australia, I found it quite interesting. And I agree with you that India is the least reliable. But you know that according to the latest Southeast Asian Annual Survey 2023, India recorded the most significant improvement in trust ratings from Southeast Asian countries. And for the United States, you said that even though it is a huge investor in the region and has big diplomatic footprint in the Southeast Asia, it may not be the best candidate because Southeast Asian countries feel that the U.S. is pressuring them to choose partners. But also, according to the Southeast Asian survey this year, it revealed that while Japan maintained its lead as the most trusted partner with 54.5%, I find that the US also came very close, second with 54.2%. And interestingly, the survey also revealed that if ASEAN were forced to choose between the US and China, two-thirds of the respondents, more than 61%, will vote for the US. And you also mentioned the Asia Power Index in your talk, and it also indicated many positive assessment for the US. So with these results, do you think that if the US can surpass Japan to be the most trusted partner of ASEAN in the coming years, or in other words, among the four Quad members, which you see as the most probable actor in bridging ASEAN and Quad cooperation? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. This is a few questions. So as we are thinking about the ranking in terms of trust within the region, Japan has some comparative advantages. One, it's in the region. Two, it has a long track record. Three, it's seen as a country that can balance China quite well and knows how to engage with China. In that sense, I expect Japan to continue to have a very strong presence and ranking within the Institute of Southeast Asian Countries surveys. But we should also think about this in the broader context that comparatively, Japan has lost its position in Southeast Asia vis-a-vis China, as China was very proactive in providing vaccines during the pandemic. They continue to engage in diplomacy towards Southeast Asia. And especially as we move out of the pandemic and we start to see a resumption of travels of Chinese tourists, that's going to be a huge injection of cash into Southeast Asia, which in my assumption will probably see a slightly higher position of China in Southeast Asia next year. But also continued reservations about its behavior in the South China Sea. Where will the United States be? This will depend on what the Biden administration will be doing in terms of its Southeast Asian diplomacy. If he visits the region again, if he holds summits with the Southeast Asian Association of Southeast Asian Countries nations, this would all be a plus. But the broader pattern is, from ASEAN's point of view, is that the American leaders come once, and then they come the next time they're elected, rather than frequently coming to the region, like we see with the Japanese or the Koreans or the Chinese, who meet with other ASEAN leaders at least once a year, if not more. So I think that the United States is of course improved its position. This is probably related to coming out of the pandemic, probably related to the previous occupant of the White House no longer there, and as well as much more coherent, systematic, and well-organized foreign policy within the region and globally. But I don't see the United States at this stage surpassing Japan until it engages in a trade agreement, and I just don't see that happening anytime soon.
Yes, thank you, Professor.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Lin. Gabor, hello, how are you today?
Thank you. Good evening. It's always my pleasure to hear you, Stephen, giving us a briefing. Good to see you, hear you, Lin, also. I have two questions, and one is President Marcos of the Philippines just visited Japan, and he said a very interesting thing that if there were any Chinese attack on Taiwan or tension in any conflict in the Taiwan Strait, he says it's very hard to imagine a scenario where the Philippines will not somehow get involved, given the geographical location and vicinity and the short distance between the Philippines and Taiwan. And this is something I haven't heard before of a leader of the Philippines. I'd like to hear your take on it, Stephen. Does it change a more balance? Does it mean a more balanced foreign policy orientation for the Philippines? Because when Duterte stepped in as a new president in the Philippines, he really was considered as a pro-China and tried to maintain ties with China, giving concessions to China. But this is a different language that I read in this interview with Nikkei. I'm
thanks,
just
Gabor.
curious.
Great question. So I think as I'm looking at the visit of Marcos to Japan, we got to put it into context that he also visited China recently. And if we look at the broader foreign policy announcements by the Philippines, it's friend to all, enemy to none. So in terms of rhetoric, there's more clarity. In terms of behavior, though, we see similarly, visiting China and then visiting Japan, but also at the same time strengthening relationships with the United States, allowing American troops to visit the Philippines more regularly. I also think the comments about talking about how the Philippines cannot really escape the Taiwan trap. I think this is a pragmatic and realistic assessment that if there was some kind of forced reunification with Taiwan, which I don't think is on the table, that the Philippines would either be involved in some kind of operation to supply Americans and whoever else will try to fight back against the Chinese to defend the Taiwanese. So this puts them in the position where they're directly related to the conflict. That doesn't mean they're fighting the Chinese alongside the Americans, but it definitely puts them in a position where they are providing their territories as a position where to allow for the Americans and other countries to resist the Chinese. In that way, I think there's some parallels to what we've seen in the United States, as Taiwan would be, or in Ukraine, is that Taiwan would be the battle place, and there would be neighboring countries that would be interested in supplying arms and other forms of deterrence to help the Taiwanese defend themselves. Now, what explains the Marcos position? I think the former president of the Philippines had a track record of bad experiences with the Americans that came out in his policies. But I also think, we shouldn't just understand the Duterte administration from that lens. I think that he understood that by courting the Chinese, he could also court the Japanese, as well as Americans and Australians, in effect to get us to court the Chinese in order to compel other countries to provide more aid, more engagement, more diplomatic support for the Philippines. And that's probably the right move, although it doesn't sound so tasteful in terms of the Philippines' position. It wants to get as much aid as possible, help with building infrastructure and connectivity so that it can open up its economy. It needs trade partners throughout the region. And the position doesn't surprise me. That being said, I think you should consider the length of time he was here in Japan. So I think 5 days, which is a lot. Which is a long time.
It's pretty long. It's unusually long for a state. Yeah. Yes.
I mean, that's long. And I think the amount of effort that was put in was also significant on the Japanese side to again court the Philippines to ensure that they are on the same page of the book as the Japanese. I would say that the Philippines' equation of their national leadership again is how to get their economy moving, how to get their move their economy and position their economy so that it can take advantage of the recent developments such as AI, more service-based economies. And they want to open up their economy so that they can use their people to help it develop. And I think that Marcos has a vision where it leans towards the United States and Japan and other Western countries, but at the same time doesn't say no to the economic opportunities associated with the Chinese market. And that, I think, is actually a pretty wise approach.
That's quite understandable. Yes.
Yeah, and for smaller countries like the Philippines, they don't really have a choice, right? They can't make an enemy of the Chinese, and if they take too hostile of a position, the Chinese can pretty quickly overwhelm them in the areas that are sensitive for the Philippines. So they constantly have to take a cautious position, and this cautious position enables them to put strengthen relations with the United States and Japan and Australia and others. At the same time, it again continues to engage in the important trade relationships that will help it develop moving forward. So I think the Philippines is doing interesting things, and Marcos' rhetoric is much more balanced and in line with, I think, how we understand the Philippines.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And one more short question. I would like to go back to the Asia Power Index.
Yep.
And I didn't read the whole report, just the headlines that what you already mentioned, that Japan's influence is weaker, or
Yep.
Japan slid back on the scale. Is it, how we can explain that? Is it a sign of a post-Abe Japan that we don't have a leader, a strong, charismatic leader who's engaged heavily in foreign policy? Or is it more of a sign of Japan that during COVID was quite inward-looking, closed down its borders, and kind of disengaged from these otherwise important partners within the region?
So I think, like most things, there's an element of structure, and there's an element of leadership, and then there are regional, events. So in terms of structure, what I mean here is the demographic challenges that the Japanese face. It's getting smaller every year. It's piece of the economic pie is declining. Taxes are covering are being used for an increasing number of elderly population. There's almost full employment for young people, which means that they don't go into the self-defense forces. They choose, domestic companies. So the structural pressures will continue to become severe in Japan, and I'm not sure. I don't think they can reverse it, frankly. Although I wish they would. Even if they welcomed, let's say, 500,000 migrants a year for the next 10 years, that would only be 5 million people. And that's not enough to deal with the broader economic or demographic collapse that is, I think predicted pretty clearly that's going to happen by 2050, where Japan will be about 30 million or 25 million people smaller. And this is incredible. And you're from Hungary, so that's 2 Hungarys disappearing. In terms of diplomacy, I think that, if we look at Japan's position, you're correct. It continues to drop. And I think that this is partly related to the different character of leadership, comparing the late Prime Minister Abe to Suga to Prime Minister Kishida. I think it's choices about not being proactive and not visiting the region throughout the pandemic. I think this was not the right choice, and I've written very publicly about this. They should have been out and about and visiting every single country during the pandemic to continue to show how engaged they were, and they didn't do that. So this is not because Prime Minister Abe was, he stepped down in the summer of 2021, right, or 2020, and after that it was Suga and then Kishida. But this was, I think, a choice that they made associated with the pandemic. So I think this is quite interesting. The diplomatic influence is declining. But on the other hand, we can look at financial inducements and financial loans in Southeast Asia. Japan is still the number 1 financer. The footprint of Japanese corporations in Southeast Asia and China is really heavy. So they do have some advantages, but these will become more and more difficult in the coming years. So lastly, the COVID. What did COVID and the Ukraine war and high prices in terms of energy, how has this affected Japan? And I think that these have all negatively affected Japan. And they're in the midst of trying to find a new path forward. I think they'll be successful, but this will not be able to will probably not be able to deal with the demographic crunch that is coming, making Japan probably a less influential country in the next 10 years in terms of its economic footprint. And I say that with sadness, but I think that's what sensible data says.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Let me just add to that, Gabor, because I think the bad news about Australia or about Japan was, we should put that in context. India, South Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, Australia, India, Malaysia, all the middle powers, economically, they all have gone down. In terms of military capabilities, Japan's went up, with the new national security strategy and some of its investments. Same with Australia, but not that much. In terms of diplomatic influence, again, Japan's gone down. India has done relatively well, but not in its own backyard. Australia's done very well, especially under the Albanese government. South Korea under the Yoon administration has done much better. So it's a mixed bag, and I think it's important to compare and see what the local politics how they've affected the Indo-Pacific dynamics.
Yeah. Thank you very much
for that conversation. Yes, thank you. Just probably it will connect, to what you discussed just now, because we have a comment from Lin Gwen. She wrote that while Southeast Asian countries really want the US presence in the region to balance against China, Lee thinks that they want the presence through the ASEAN mechanism to avoid triggering China. Is it a limit to the realization of Quad or AUKUS visions in the region? This is the question.
So, thank you, Lee. So superficially, I think you're correct that they would prefer the ASEAN centrality to be recognized, and that engagement within the region is through accepting ASEAN centrality. and that is the public statement, and that will be the public statement as long as ASEAN is an organization. But privately, the views are often different. They are happy with the Quad because it concentrates more resources within the region, and as they've seen the Quad evolve to provide public goods, it is creating different dynamics. On AUKUS, very divided. I think that the Chinese have been very, very aggressive in bringing up the Quad and AUKUS when they visit their ASEAN counterparts to talk about how these are not positive minilateral agreements. But countries like Vietnam or countries like the Philippines or Indonesia, they also have their private view, and they keep that close to their chest because they understand that they have an interest in keeping the United States in the region. If it's these minilateral relationships that do that, then they're going to support it. And I think that they are supportive of these minilateral initiatives because, again, they're bringing diplomacy, they're bringing focus, they're bringing cooperation, and they're bringing assets to the region that make it more difficult for China to dominate. And ultimately, ASEAN is about securing strategic autonomy. They used to be able to do that by, engaging what I call ostrich diplomacy, stick their head in the ground, and hopefully everything is different or the same when they pull out their head out of the ground. But now I think they understand that they have to be more proactive in balancing China and the United States through working economically with China, but also accepting at least non-tangentially the role of these new minilaterals in providing more diplomatic support to the region.
Well, thank you for the answer, Lee. I hope that this was the answer to your question. And Mark, hello, good evening to you. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes. Hello, Professor. Sorry,
Hi, Mark.
because I'm packing up for the trimester break way to Tokyo.
Yeah, I'll see you next week.
Okay, sure. I guess my question, I guess I want to say that I've been following the news about the spy balloons you mentioned a while ago, and recently I spotted some news that there were some spotted in Japan. So I am not sure how this will play out with the tensions between the U.S. and China, because lately I've been hearing from the U.S. side there's not much communication from Beijing side because they want to talk it out. So I don't know how this will play out in the next few weeks, because otherwise I think it'd be interesting to see how they can work it out.
So thanks, Mark. Balloon Gate, or however you want to talk about it. I think that there's not enough information at this stage to find out what exactly these balloons were, where they came from, what they were doing. I think that the Biden administration had no possible way to back down from the balloon gate and had to shoot it down. Without doing that, he would have appeared weak in front of the Republicans, and then it would have been an opportunity for them to, continue attacking the Biden administration. On the Chinese side, my sense is that if this was an accident and it really floated off, off the normal course of travel, that he was not in a position to apologize publicly, that this was an accident, we take responsibility, we are sorry, we would, let's take it down together. So I don't think they were in a position to take a more, neutral position, which really is the state of the bilateral relations, is that they're not able to communicate well, they're not able to, that the public and their political opponents are creating a more difficult set of conditions to make independent decisions about things like balloons. And I think that this is a real problem. Where will it go in the coming months? I think we need to find out, what did they shoot down? What was it doing? Are these other ones that they've been shooting down, are they similar? Is this something that's substantial? I just think there's too many questions, Mark, at this stage to say much more than that. I think, again, it's just more of a litmus test of the degree of dysfunction and how domestic politics is driving decisions of leaders, rather than the facts.
Oh yes, I definitely agree.
Yeah, it's unfortunate.
It is unfortunate indeed. Hopefully we'll see, hopefully, I say hopefully, we'll see leaders who also can balance between domestic politics and geopolitics in the future. But one thing, anyway, is that definitely the world needs better communication channels between the two superpowers, if I can say so, because we have seen how the lack of those communication channels or their or dysfunction, can create really quite difficult moments. And I would say that it happens not only between the U.S. and China, but also between the U.S. and Russia, and so on and so on.
Well, the normal track of diplomacy, though, Maya, is this, and I wrote this today. It's really long, boring discussions, listening to your counterpart, being patient, finding out what they think, and then finding creative ways to build trust or shift the initiative. And these kinds of discussions, don't lend themselves to the media. And this is how I think diplomacy worked in the past. But now, media is chasing these events and following every motion and expecting probably too much in every meeting. There's no game changers in announcements. They take a lot of hard work and discussions between counterparts in 2 or 3 or 5 different countries, and we're not there between the Chinese and the Japanese, the Chinese and the Japanese, or the United States and the Chinese, and this makes shifting the dynamics really, really difficult. Really, really difficult, because somebody wants to write a story and highlight that nothing's working, and this is a real deep concern. If we look back to the normalization of U.S.-China relations in the early 70s, there was a lot of off-the-record diplomacy that went on that the media didn't know about, and it set the conditions for Nixon visiting China and eventually normalization. And I think this really speaks to the importance of moving some of the Indo-Pacific political dynamics back to the backdoor diplomacy, and letting policymakers work out things rather than publicizing it in the media.
Well, I cannot agree more with you, because we have seen how actually this is it's like a spiral. It goes down and down. So, as you say, the media, they're not interested in things that are working, they're interested in things that are not. And so they amplify those things by writing about them and so on and so on. And at the end of the day, the politicians or the policymakers, they become even more sensitive. And I would say that they're even more afraid of taking bold actions, in the direction of solving potential problems or even existing problems anyway. So
it's really, 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 really difficult. And
it is.
How to move out of that dynamic is a really interesting question. Neither country is in a position that they're easily able to do that.
Indeed. Yeah. Well, but let's see. Hopefully, there will be a way out, and I'm sure that we haven't found the door, and we haven't opened it yet to that way out. But hopefully there will be something, in the near future. Yeah, I know. We can laugh, and it's on my side it's usually a bitter laughter, but one can always hope anyway. So with this, I think that we have more or less exhausted the questions. Actually, there are quite a few comments in the room chat by Hiroaki, so I hope that you read already. You have read them. If you haven't, this room, the recording will stay in Clubhouse, so you can come back and read them later. And well, Stephen, before we close the room, a few words in conclusion from you.
So if anybody's interested, again, I'll be hosting the Ukrainian ambassador to Japan on February 24th. here in Tokyo live to have a discussion about the invasion of Ukraine 1 year on. You're more than welcome to come to that. You'll need to register through the YCAP's website, and hopefully this will be a great opportunity again to discuss a very contemporary issue and talk about how the geopolitics of different parts of the world are related to, we can't separate what happens in Europe and what happens in the Indo-Pacific anymore. I really welcome you to that event, and I look forward to talking to you all in a couple weeks.
Thank you. Great. Well, once again, we'll be here in 2 weeks. That is, let me see when it is actually. So that is March the 13th. We're going to be here on Monday at 8 o'clock. So please join us again. And once again, at that point, we're going to talk about the latest events in the Indo-Pacific. Again, thank you very much, and we'll see you then. This was Japan Expert Insights on geopolitics in the Indo-Pacific and Japan's role in the region. Thank you for coming and staying with us today. We will be on air in 2 weeks on Monday at 8:30 p.m. Japan time again, so join us. Until then, you can find us at japanexpertinsights.com and our YouTube channel, where we upload audio episodes on Japanese politics, business insights, and the role of Japan in the Indo-Pacific region. If you want to stay informed about our upcoming events, you can follow us on Clubhouse, LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. Again, we are looking forward to your joining us next week. Until then, stay well and make every day count. See you.